Good evening and welcome. My name is Sarah Fogg and I'm head of communications here at the Montreal Holocast Museum. We thank you for joining us this evening in commemoration of Kristallnacht. Before beginning tonight's event, I would like to honor the presence of the Holocaust survivors who are in attendance this evening. I would also like to highlight the presence of a few individuals. Elias Wolf, Consul General of Israel, Wilfried Pfeffer, Consul General of Belgium, Christian Wagner, Consul General of the Federal Republic of Germany, Isabella Fabianska-Potapczuk, Consul General of Poland, Helga Katalin Pritz, Consul General of Hungary, David Michael Jones, Consul General of the United Kingdom, as well as Elizabeth Prass, Member of the National Assembly, Mitchell Brownstein, Mayor of Côte Saint-Luc, Alain de Sousa, Mayor of Saint Laurent, Michael Stern, Mayor of Westmount, Arif Salam, a dear friend of the museum from the city of Montreal. We're also joined by several city councillors from Côte Saint-Luc, Outremont, Côte-des-Neiges NDG, and Saint Laurent, as well as the honorary consul generals of Austria and Iceland, Eric Bissell and Robert Korn. I now have the privilege of welcoming the Honorable Jacques Sarada, co-president of our museum, to the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, avant tout, mes premières paroles seront pour les diplomates, les élus qui sont parmi nous ce soir. Vous ne pouvez imaginer à quel point votre présence est importante, symbolique et signifiante pour toute notre communauté. Merci beaucoup de votre présence. Thank you. Ce soir, nous nous réunissons pour commémorer Kristallnacht, la nuit de cristal, qui, il y a 87 ans, a vu une vague de terreur déferler sur les Juifs sous l'occupation nazie. Des synagogues ont été incendiées, des commerces appartenant à des Juifs ont été saccagés, des vies ont été détruites, et l'avertissement lancé au monde entier est resté lettre morte. We come together alongside our colleagues and partners at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights to honor the memory of those whose lives were forever changed in the aftermath of Kristallnacht, and to reflect on how fragile civilization can be when hatred is left unanswered. Many of the survivors who once stood before us to share their stories are no longer with us. Yet their voices continue to resonate through the work we do here at the Montreal Holocast Museum. Their courage, their memories, and their lessons live on in our exhibitions, our educational programs, and in every young person who learns not only what happened, but why it must never happen again. Le souvenir et l'éducation ne sont pas des actes passifs, ce sont des actes de résistance. Des actes de résistance et de transformation. Dans un monde où l'antisémitisme et la haine persistent, notre responsabilité est de nous souvenir, d'enseigner et d'agir. Cette responsabilité, nous l'assumons avec espoir et détermination. Et ce nouveau musée de l'Holocauste qui ouvrira ses portes en 2027 symbolisera encore davantage cette détermination, cet esprit de résistance face à la vague d'antisémitisme qui submerge le monde. Une résistance forte, une résistance sereine, une résistance inclusive. So tonight, as we light our candles and remember the shattered glass of that November night, let us reaffirm our promise that we will preserve the memory of those victims, honor the courage of the survivors, and continue to educate, so that never again is not merely a phrase, but a commitment we renew together. Tonight, we explore the aftermath of Kristallnacht and the destruction of the vibrant Jewish life that existed in Europe for centuries. After the commemorative portion of tonight's event, we will hear a meaningful discussion with author and photographer David Kaufman about his latest book, The Posthumous Landscape, Remnants of Jewish Life in Eastern Europe. The conversation will be led by Norman Ravine, professor in the Department of Religions and Cultures at Concordia University. Ce soir aussi, nous accueillons avec grand plaisir le nouveau consul général d'Israël à Montréal, Elias Louf. The State of Israel stands as a testament to the resilience and renewal of the Jewish people after the darkest chapters of our history. The presence, your presence, Monsieur le Consul Général, reminds us of the unbreakable bond between remembrance and hope, between memory and ongoing work of building a world rooted in justice, security and peace. Je vous invite à accueillir très chaleureusement Monsieur le Consul Général d'Israël, Elias Louf.
Before coming here, I participated in the ceremony of the Westmount city to commemorate the Canadian soldiers, the others. I was proud to lay a wreath on behalf of the State of Israel, and I think we all, as Jewish people, should be very thankful to Canadian, British, and Americans, Russians, and many others that fought and defeated eventually the Nazis. Among them, a lot of Jewish soldiers, as we all know. But the war back then, the Second World War, was not about the Jews. The Kristallnacht is a very symbolic point in the terrible times of the 30s and the 40s, where the destruction of Jewish life got into a phase that first it was accepted, and it was not only about destruction of Jewish life, it was destruction of life of the Jews. And the Jews there were begging for mercy. There was no mercy. There was no other country that wanted them, and they were catched in the trap, and eventually they were doomed, as we all know. There is no any other way to talk about it, and there is no reason to think what did it happen, or is it should we blame the Jewish people themselves, or maybe they did something wrong, because we the Jews, we always do something wrong, apparently. There was no state of Israel. I think just a few people heard about Gaza or any other place like that. And they thought, okay, those are people without land, so perhaps we should get rid of them. Now when we have land, we have people that say that perhaps we should get rid of them. So the most important lesson, besides remembering, which of course is essential, is that the Jews can never, ever again be defenseless. And not being defenseless means that the Jews should first of all know how to protect themselves and be responsible for their own security. And people should know around the world that if there is another plan of Kristallnachts or terrorist attacks or any attacks against Jews, the price that the attackers will pay will be its own destruction. There is no other way. The world sometimes is a jungle, and in a jungle you better be strong and forceful and know how to defend yourself. We should never ever be relied on other people's mercy, but we should take our own security in our own hands. This is the lesson, and we try to make it realistic, and I think we did did it successfully in Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now have the honor of inviting Miss Elizabeth Prass, M&A for Darcy McGee, and longtime ally of the museum to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir à tous et à toutes. I'm honored to be here with you on this tonight on this 87th anniversary of Kristallnacht, a somber moment of remembrance and reflection. Thank you to the Montreal Holocast Museum for organizing this important commemoration and for your tireless work to preserve memory and educate future generations. I'd like to acknowledge the Israeli consul, Elias Luf, and all the other foreign dignitaries here, as well as the mayors and city councillors. Je souhaite également souligner la présence ce soir de David Kaufman, auteur et photographe, ainsi que Norman Ravin, professeur au département des religions et des cultures de l'Université de Concordia. Leur participation enrichit notre commémoration et rappelle l'importance de réfléchir sur l'histoire et ses leçons pour aujourd'hui. C'est donc avec humilité que je prends la parole ce soir pour rendre hommage aux victimes de la nuit de cristal et à toutes celles et ceux qui en souffrent sous la barbarie nazie. Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, occurred on the nights of November 9th and 10th, 1938, when Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues across Germany and Austria were attacked and destroyed. Thousands were arrested, and countless lives were forever changed. It marks a chilling turning point in the systemic persecution of Jews by the Nazis, when being Jewish became a crime. Kristallnacht marked the transition from hatred in words to hatred in actions, from prejudice to persecution, from silence to complicity. And it taught us that when hate goes unchecked, democracy itself begins to crack. As a Jewish member of the Quebec National Assembly, I stand here not only as a representative, but as a daughter, a granddaughter, and a mother, someone whose very existence is bound to the promise of never again. That promise is not a slogan, it is a duty, and tonight it feels heavier than ever. Across the world, and even here at home, we are witnessing a resurgence of anti-Semitism and misinformation. As Jews, we know all too well how dangerous words can become when left unchallenged. Since the horrific terrorist attacks of October 7th, Jewish communities in Montreal and beyond have once again been targeted with hostility and fear. And tonight, the lesson of Kristallnacht is not only to remember what happened, but to recognize when it begins to happen again. We honor the memory of those lost not only through tears, but through action. By standing up, by speaking out, by educating our children, by strengthening the bonds of solidarity amongst all communities targeted by hate. These moments remind us that remembrance is not enough. We must also act by standing proudly as a community and by speaking against intolerance and by educating the next generation so that hatred never finds fertile ground again. À la lumière des événements récents, il est plus important que jamais de renforcer la compréhension, de promouvoir le dialogue et de défendre les valeurs d'humanité et de respect. Nous devons rester vigilants et unis face à toute forme d'antisémitisme. As we gather tonight, let us renew our collective promise to remember, to resist hate, and to ensure that never again is not just a phrase from the past, but a living commitment for the future. Am Israel Chai.
Thank you, Ms. Prass. To conclude the commemorative portion of our evening, I would like to invite Chazan Shani Reverend Amiel Bender of the Tifrei Beth David Jerusalem Synagogue to recite the commemorative prayer and Kaddish. Joining him will be Eric Bissell, Holocaust survivor from Vienna, Austria, to light the memorial candle.
Dayan omanot v'avietomiyim Ana techashevet itapak L'dam Yisrael Shenishbach kama yima Hamitzei menucha nechona Kanfei hashchina B'malawot Kedoshim u'teoriyim Kizor Akiyah Mirim Masiriyim Livishmotehem Shurivot Alfei Yisrael Anashim V'nashim Yiladim V'yiladot Shenergo V'nishchatovo V'nisrefovo V'nechnikovo V'nigro chayim V'aratzad asher nagabahen Yad atzor Germani u'grav Yimach shemam Kulam Kedoshim u'toriyim Uvahem yonim v'tzadikiyim Arzel v'navan Adirei ha'torah Beganei dentehe menuchatavam Lachain balarachamim Yastirei beseder knafav lolamim Tzor tzorachamim nishmateyavem Adonai hunachalatam V'yanuchu v'shalom al mishkvoteyavem V'nomar Amen. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shmei rabah Be'alma ivra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei V'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei v'chol beit Yisrael V'agala v'bizman kariv v'imru amen Yehei shmei rabah v'varach le'olam v'lamei almayah Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitroman v'yitnaseh V'yitadar v'yit'ale v'yit'alal shmei v'kusha v'rihu Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata Tishbechata v'nechmata da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen Yehei shlama rabba min shmaya V'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen Oseh shalom b'imromav U'ya'aseh shalom aleinu Ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru
Thank you. You may all be seated. As we move on to the discussion tonight about the remarkable new photography book, The Posthumous Landscape, Remnants of Jewish Life in Eastern Europe, I'd like to take a few moments just to introduce our speakers. Our moderator, Norman Rabin, is a prolific writer, critic, journalist, and professor in the Department of Religious Cultures at Concordia University, where he was the department's chair in Canadian Jewish Studies for 13 years. His scholarly research has focused on North American and European Holocaust literature, including Yiddish materials and memory books. His writing and teaching have been focused on his travel in Poland, and he has been involved in heritage projects in his mother's birthplace of Razanov. His long and impressive list of publications include a memoir, Who Gets In, an immigration story, a novel set in Vancouver and Poland called The Girl Who Stole Everything, and A House of Words, Jewish Writing, Identity, and Memory. David Kaufman is a Canadian documentary filmmaker and photographer based in Toronto. His photographic work focuses primarily on the architectural image and the urban landscape. His work from 2007 to 2016 in Eastern Europe is represented in his new book, which we're discussing tonight, and in a traveling exhibition of the same name. His 2013 photo exhibit depicting Toronto heritage streetscapes was named a must-see show by Toronto Life and Now magazine. Other recent exhibitions include Architectural Devolution, Industrial Buildings in a Post-Industrial World, Built to Last, Montreal's Enduring Architecture, and Vessels of Song, Faces of New Jewish Music. Kaufman's first film was the widely distributed biography, A.M. Klein, The Poet as Landscape. He subsequently spent 18 years at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, working as a producer and director on two of its top programs, The Journal and The Fifth Estate, before moving on to the independent film sector. His documentaries have appeared on CBC, PBS, Bravo, and History Channel, and include feature programs about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and klezmer music revival. He is now working on a feature documentary about the Yiddish writer Chava Rosenfeld to be released in 2026. Please welcome to the stage Norman and David.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. On? Yes. So we're glad to see you, and we're here really to hear from David and see his beautiful photographs. But let me just say first that lousy weather is instructive for our topic. If you look at lots of photographs of the wartime in Poland and other places east, you know that everything's worse in the winter. And as you see the great selection of things that David will show you, it looks like he's avoided the Polish winter. But maybe we'll ask him about that. So, travel in Poland is something that David's taken seriously over a long period of time, and things have changed over the years. And his earliest visit was in 1992. So the first thing that I'd like to ask him to do for us is talk about his entree into that travel and what drew him there, and then also what the creative projects were that he first undertook as he was visiting Poland.
I've had a two-track career as a documentary filmmaker and as a serious photographer. I grew up in Montreal. I attended the Adath Israel Academy, both elementary school and high school in the 1950s, and I spent 10 years at Camp Masad, a Hebrew-speaking Zionist camp. So as a young person, I was imbued with a serious respect and understanding of Jewish culture and religion and history. I then developed a career later in my life as a documentary filmmaker, and parallel to that as a serious photographer, mostly of architectural imagery. And I went to work for the CBC for 18 years. I worked on the Journal and the Fifth Estate. But late in my career at the Fifth Estate, I really wanted to return to material that was closer to my Jewish heart, to concerns that were deeply held about Jewish history and culture. As you heard, my first film was about the Canadian Jewish poet A.M. Klein, which I completed in 1978. Anyway, in 1992, I approached my executive producer at the Fifth Estate, and I asked her if I could do a piece on Jewish child survivors in Poland, and she said yes, to my amazement. So I went to Poland for the first time in 1992. And while in Poland, there was a crisis at a high school in a small town called Kazimierz Dolny. I think it was there. There was a high school named after Janusz Korczak, the famous child psychologist from the Warsaw Ghetto, who went to Treblinka with his charges. And in this high school, ironically, part of their sports field was built on a old Jewish cemetery. And there was a controversy because they were digging up the sports field to install a hot water line, and they discovered human remains. And clearly they were remains of Jews who had been buried there. And they didn't know what to do. There was some local controversy, and frankly, I don't remember what the outcome of the controversy was. But my reporter and I from CBC, we went to that town, and we went to the sports field, and in a corner of the sports field, there was a stack of matzevot, of gravestones. And they had beautiful calligraphy, unlike anything I had seen on Rue de la Savane. Beautiful artwork on the top of the gravestones. And I was deeply impressed by the quality of the memorial art that I saw in that time. On the same trip, you can see here, can we have the lights lower, please? That's great. On the same trip in the airport at Warsaw, I picked up a book called Time of Stones. This was a book published by a Polish-Jewish artist named Monika Krajewska, and it was published in 1983. And don't forget, at the time, publishing was strictly controlled by the Polish government. It was the very, very first book to be published in Poland that dealt with the state and history of Polish Jewish cemeteries. Now, the state of Polish Jewish cemeteries at that time was one of neglect. Many cemeteries were abandoned, not cared for. But I was struck by the fact that everywhere that Monika Krajewska went, she found gravestones of extremely beautiful artistry. And I was very impressed by that. I pored over that book at home when I got home, and that book reinforced the feeling I had in that high school where I had seen Matsejewot in Poland for the first time. And I thought, okay, this is a project, a photographic project that I could undertake for myself. Well, I returned to Poland twice more, in 2002 and 2007, to work on films about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and about the Lodz Ghetto. And in September 2007, I finally decided that I was going to embark on my photographic project. I thought on Jewish cemeteries initially, and this is one of the first photos I took in the Lodz Jewish Cemetery, which was founded in 1892. And this is a photo in the oldest part of the Lodz Cemetery with stones from the end of the 19th century. Following that, I went back to Poland about 8 times between 2007 and 2015. And then in 2016, I also went to Western Ukraine. And these are about 50 of the places that my wife and I went. And we also made a short trip to the Baltic states in 2016. Of course, I decided to shoot more than cemeteries. As my work progressed, I began to shoot synagogues, Jewish architecture and Jewish neighborhoods, and also Holocaust sites to a limited extent. And I want to explain why I say Holocaust sites to a limited extent. My project, in a way, was not about the Holocaust. There were many books that have been done about the Holocaust. I wanted to try to reclaim in my photography images of Jewish life as they existed before the Holocaust. So that's why there were fewer pictures of the Holocaust in my project and more pictures of what was left from Jewish life in an earlier time.
So David gives an impression of some of the challenges inherent in traveling in Poland and the choices that you make based on things that are alive and things that are not. And you can be in cities and walk and involve yourself, and then you're also in some way magnetized by the things that are remnants that are retained. And so among the most important of those are the cemeteries. And David starts to talk about these. And if you see his book, you'll see that it's a somewhat substantial component of the things that he's photographing, and he visits the major ones. We'll come to the one at Lodz later. And then he goes, of course, to the very substantial intact one in near central Warsaw, in Okupowa, that's not far from the Poland Museum. But then he does some wonderful narratives associated with lesser known places. So I'm going to ask that he tell us a bit about visiting the major cemeteries and then these kind of more further afield ones.
As you know, Jewish cemeteries are the most common remnants of Jewish material culture in Eastern Europe. In Poland alone, there are about 1,000 different cemeteries, of which only 500 have Jewish Matsejewot. And in Ukraine, there are about 750 cemeteries. My first exposure to Jewish cemeteries was in Warsaw. As all of you know, the Warsaw Jewish community was the largest Jewish community in Europe before the war, with 375,000 people. And that both the community and the physical aspect of the community, the Warsaw Ghetto, were completely destroyed during the war. The irony of that, of course, is that in the city with the largest Jewish population prior to the war, they had the smallest amount of Jewish material culture of any major city, except for the Okupowa Street Jewish Cemetery, which along with Lodz is one of the two, they're the two largest Jewish cemeteries in Poland, and they are among the two largest Jewish cemeteries in the world. The Okapowa Street Cemetery was founded in 1806. It has become what I like to call a great garden of history or a precinct of memory. There are 225,000 grave sites in that cemetery, and I guess more than 100,000 tombstones still exist there. Within its walls, you can see the entire history of Warsaw Jewry that can be deciphered and appreciated. And unlike North American cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries, Okapowa Street is like a forest. It resembles a forest, but before the war, there were hardly any trees there. And the reason there are so many trees there today is because after the war, the cemetery was neglected for 6 decades, especially under Soviet rules, and trees grew up, so that now it's like a beautiful forest. And I think there's a wonderful tension between the greenery and the organized rows of carved tombstones. There's a wonderful tension between those things, and it makes for wonderful photographs, and is a striking context both for the history and culture of the cemetery. The other thing to say about the major cemeteries is that the cemeteries in Lodz and Warsaw escaped damage during the Second World War. They were virtually undamaged both during the Nazi period and also during the Soviet period. And the reason for that is that both of these cemeteries were contained within the boundaries of the ghettos. And so many people were dying in the time of the ghetto from hunger and starvation and from violence, that in each cemetery, the Germans decided to maintain them as functioning burial grounds because there was no other place to bury the thousands of people who died at the time. So the Germans' fear of contagion and of disease spreading to the living overcame their desire to destroy Jewish artifacts, and permitted the cemeteries to function and to operate with a semblance of normality. Now, there are some cemeteries in smaller places that have not survived really because of communal efforts, but they've survived more or less because of the efforts of a few individuals or sometimes single people. And one of those cemeteries is in a town called Bochnia, which was established in 1872. It's located, the town is located about 40 kilometers east of Krakow. And there was a single caretaker who took care of this cemetery for 60 years. This photo is not my photo. It's a photo by another photographer, Jason Francisco from Atlanta, Georgia. When we met Mr. Gavad, the caretaker, his name was Leon Gavad, and when we met him, he was 91 years old, and he told us he had been working for 6 decades, and his work was supported by 3 people who were from the area, now living in the United States. During his decades of care, he had placed upright all the more than 700 stones in the cemetery, returned them to their proper positions. He had maintained and cleaned the grounds for every year. He had planted maple trees around the perimeter of the cemetery to demark its boundaries. He'd erected a fence by himself, and he had planted an orchard of trees at the entrance. He also showed us a handwritten book, a registry of the more than 700 people who were buried there, with the family names and the location of every gravestone, so that when people visited the cemetery, he could direct them to the right location. We asked Leon Gavad why he had dedicated his life to maintaining this cemetery, and he told us that he felt a debt to the Jewish friends that he had in the town before the war. He also told us that he had a brother who had been imprisoned in Auschwitz as a political prisoner, and that he had lost many people during the war of his family. Gavad was honored by Polish Jewish communities for his work in Bochnia, and he died in 2018 at the age of 97. There are other cemeteries all throughout Poland where there are very, very beautiful stones. that are in danger of erosion or of disappearing because the cemeteries cannot be maintained that well. There's simply not enough resources or people to maintain small cemeteries in small towns. This is a Jewish cemetery that's 400 years old in the town of Ozarov. It has many, many extremely beautiful stones. The Nazis looted most of the stones from the cemetery during the war, but there were about 300 stones left in the cemetery, and the cemetery was rehabilitated in 2001 by Ozarov Jews now living in Canada and the United States. Several of the stones I saw there were absolutely among the most beautiful stones we saw in any cemetery in Poland. These three stones are from 1902, 1892, and 1912. All of them are stones for women, and you can see that they all have traces of Jewish polychromy. There was a custom in the 19th century to paint Jewish gravestones with colored paint, and you can see traces of the paint on these stones. The stones have traditional iconography for women. You can see candlesticks, vases, flowers, crowns, tzedakah or charity boxes, and the engraving and calligraphy displays an unusually high quality of artistry. You can see on the right-hand stone beautiful engraving of grapes and vines. The middle stone has engravings of curtains, and the left stone also has beautiful engravings. Whenever I see stones like this, I'm actually filled with despair at the thought they may be left outside for decades from now, where the weather and neglect will actually destroy them. I think that stones like this should be taken from where they are and put in Jewish art museums, such as the Museum Polin in Warsaw today, and replicas replaced on the gravestones. But no one has ever done that, and of course no one has asked me my opinion of what should be done.
So David sets you up to know what to look for when you go to these places, if you go. And at Okapova, things have been happening following the change of government in Poland. So the end of the Law and Justice government was important for that cemetery because the right-wing government there was leveraging some very bad things that were happening, which are on, but they're on the ground, but they'll stop now because you have a different government. So when we were writing back and forth, David wrote to me, Lodz, our favorite place in Poland. The Poles say Łódź, but we say it in Yiddish, you get to say Lodz. And it's true, it's a magnet for a number of reasons, one of them being that the Germans did not destroy it the way they leveled Warsaw by the end of the war. So David has a lot to say about how that city drew him and in what ways specific sites and focal points have been a major interest for his photography.
Well, the city of Lodz, as Norm said, basically escaped damage during the Second World War. There was a marketplace, I think it was called the Fish Market, just north of the center of town, and that marketplace was destroyed by the Germans, and there's a beautiful park now. But really, the rest of Lodz, and you can see it here, when you walk through the streets of Lodz, certainly at the time we were there, which was 10 years ago, I'd say walking through the streets of Lodz is like walking through history. Lodz evolved rapidly. It was a village in the early 1800s, and it grew to be Poland's second largest city by the turn of the 20th century, and its growth was fueled very rapidly by the creation and development of a local textile industry. And as the city developed, tens of thousands of Jews poured into Lodz from the rest of Poland and from the Pale of Settlement, so that by the time of the First World War, there were 167,000 Jews in Lodz, 1/3 of the population, and before the Second World War, there were 230,000 Jews in Lodz. Lodz's economy was built on the backs of German and Jewish textile entrepreneurs, business people who created the textile industry. And one of the most famous of them was Israel Kalman Posnansky, who lived from 1833 until 1900. Posnanski began as the owner of a very modest trading company, which he inherited from his father, and then he built up a huge enterprise on Ogrodova Street, which is just north of the city center. And this complex, which he built on Ogrodova Street, still exists today. For instance, this building was the textile mill, the weaving mill, for his textile enterprise. Today it's a first-class hotel. Posnanski also commissioned Posnanski also built tenement housing. He employed 6,800 people. He built tenement houses, a hospital, an electrical generating plant, all sorts of facilities for his employees and Lodge. And if you go to Lodge today, you can still see these tenement houses across from his lavish factory. He also built for himself an incredibly lavish office building and residence, which today is known as the Posnanski Palace. The building was built over 15 years. It actually was only completed after he died. And over the years, as the fortunes of the enterprise changed, the building also changed hands many, many times. And in 1975, it was taken over by the City of Lodge, and it became the Museum of History of the City of Lodge. Posnanski's textile enterprise also survived many decades after his death. After World War II, the textile business was nationalized by the communist government, and it ran at a loss all the way up to 1989. It did not make money, but they kept it going till '89. And 10 years later, a French development company took over the whole, all the buildings that Posnanski has built, and they turned it into a lavish mall with an arts and entertainment complex known today as the Manufactura, and of course you can go there today. Now there are parts of Lodge that were not so opulent. There was a slum area north of the city center and north of Posnanski's textile enterprise called Baluti. And this is a working class district that was built in the 1850s by Jewish entrepreneurs who wanted to create low-cost housing for all the people coming into Lodge to work in the textile business. But from the beginning, it was a slum. These buildings were built without running water or sewers, and later without electricity or gas. But Baluti, known for its poverty, became home to half the Jews of Lodge. So when the Germans conquered Poland in 1940 and they occupied Lodge, this is where they set up the ghetto for the Jews, which they named the Litzmannstadt Ghetto after a World War I general. Throughout the Baluti district today, you can still see landmarks of the Lodge ghetto. One of the most famous landmarks at the southern boundary of the ghetto was St. Mary's Church. During the war, the church was turned into a storage facility for mattresses, feather bedding, and pillows. In the same area, just north of the church, you can see a building that was home for the Ghetto Statistics Bureau and Archives, which gathered detailed information about the lives of Jews during the Lodge Ghetto, and they also published their very famous Chronicle of the Lodge Ghetto. So all the work they did became invaluable records of the fate and activities of Lodge Jewry. There were other buildings on this street that were very important in the ghetto that still exist today. For instance, this building, which is now a residence, housed the printing plant for the Lodge Ghetto. The leadership of the ghetto, led by Chaim Romkowski, who was a dictator in the ghetto, appointed by the Nazis, their only way to communicate was to print handbills in Yiddish and German and Polish. So the printing plant was a very important part of the ghetto. There were other buildings on the street where there were factories. They manufactured hats and shoes, both for the German army and also for the German civilian population. When you walk around the area of the Lodge Ghetto today, you can also still see buildings that were used by the German administration. This pharmacy on the west side of the ghetto, apteka means pharmacy in Polish, was the head of the Gestapo during the years of the ghetto. It was the headquarters for the Gestapo. There was also a very famous building in Lodz called the Red House. It was a parish building close to the church and was head for the Kripo, or the criminal police in the ghetto. And the Kripo were tasked with extracting valuables from the captive Jewish population. So in the basement of this building, Jews would be tortured, often to the point of death. After the war, the building was simply returned to the church, and there's a small plaque on the building that reminds us of what took place there. And another very, very famous landmark in the Lodz ghetto is the Radegast train station, which was built in the Marashin district at the northern boundary of the city of Lodz. This train station was built in 1937, and after the ghetto was sealed in 1940, it was both a lifeline for the ghetto and also a gateway to death. All the food, all the goods that was necessary to sustain life in the ghetto came in through this train station. And when there were factories set up in the ghetto to manufacture goods for the German war effort, all the goods for the factories came in through this station, and all the manufactured goods went out. But in 1942, when the first of the deportations began in the ghetto, tens of thousands of people sent to the extermination camp at Chelmno, they left through this station. And in August 1944, when the ghetto was liquidated, and the last 70,000 Jews who had survived all 4 years of life in the ghetto were sent to their final destination, they left from this train station, and of course the final destination was Auschwitz. In 2000, for years after the war, this train station was derelict, but in 2002, a foundation for the preservation of the heritage of Lodz Jewry spent money and created a very striking memorial at the train station today. And when you go to Lodz today, you can visit this memorial. Now, Lodz also had a major cemetery, the Braca Street Cemetery. And it's a really beautiful cemetery. It was founded in 1892 on land devoted for this purpose by Israel Posthumous. It started off quite small, but today it's 104 acres. There are 180,000 burial sites and about 65,000 gravestones still in the cemetery. It's one of the two largest cemeteries in Poland, along with Warsaw, and among the largest Jewish cemeteries in the world. The whole area is enclosed by a brick wall, and there's also a beautiful funeral home, very handsome funeral home that was constructed in 1898. Of course, the outstanding landmark of the cemetery in Lodz is the mausoleum of Israel Posthumous. He died in 1900. He's buried here along with his wife, Eleonora Leonia Hertz, who died in 1914. And this is the largest Jewish mausoleum in the world. Most of the gravestones in the Lodz Jewish Cemetery are from the early 20th century. And you can see here very, very typical large gravestones from the cemetery. These stones are about 1.5 meters high, 4.5 feet high. They have very typical architecture. At the top there's a pediment with some sort of memorial art. The bottom is surrounded by 2 columns, and the columns are reminiscent of the biblical temples in Jerusalem. That's what they're supposed to signify. And at the center at the bottom is a slab, usually of marble, but sometimes of stone, which is engraved with the name of the deceased, the date of death, and usually some sort of epitaph. One of the epitaphs on one of the stones, you can see that the first letters of the epitaph form an acrostic of the first name of the deceased. You can see at the top of these stones that on 4 of them there are bookcases, and the bookcases signify that the person who died was learned. On the 5th stone we can see hands making a sign of the blessing of the Kohen, which signifies that the person who died was a descendant of the tribe of the Kohanim, a member of the hereditary Jewish priestly caste. One of the most interesting things about these 5 stones, though, They were all done during the 1920s, and you can see on 4 of the stones there are articulated columns, more or less articulated, some are simplified. But on the second stone from the left, you can see that the column and the capital of the column is done in an Art Deco design. So the person who was the mason at the time was actually cognizant of current trends in artwork and decided to imbue this gravestone with a bit of Art Deco design and artistry. It's sort of interesting. One of the most striking parts of the Lodz Jewish Cemetery is called the Ghetto Field. 43,000 people died in the Lodz Ghetto during its life. And all of those people were given an individual burial in the Ghetto Field in Lodz. There are no mass graves in the Lodz Jewish Cemetery, and records were kept so that even today, if you want to go and find out the names of people buried in this part of the cemetery, those records still exist, and you can find out who's buried there. Finally, there are many, many parts of the Lodz Cemetery which are overcome with foliage. This is a typical problem in cemeteries throughout Poland. The greenery and the vines grow very, very rapidly. And there simply are not enough resources or staff to clear all the areas of the cemetery every year that must be done. So you can see in this part of the cemetery, many lower level tombstones are completely covered with vines, and there are whole sections that you actually cannot enter. In Lodz, only one synagogue survived the war. This was a synagogue built in 1902 by a businessman in Lodz named Wolf Reicher, and the building only survived because its ownership was transferred to a German businessman during the war. The interior was destroyed, it was converted to a salt cellar, but the building survived, and in 1988, two American Jewish foundations financed a complete restoration of the synagogue.
So David gives you a nice suite of things of Lodz. I don't know if you noticed the two that didn't have the beautiful blue sky and the distinctive Kaufman light. There was Beluti with a gray sky and Radagast, some clouds. But in the book, as on the screen, I guess I don't see it as well as you do, you know, the special quality of light that David's looking for keeps showing up in the special blue skies of those visits. Moving towards the last few sets of photographs, the book does really move away from Poland and over further east into the Ukraine.
No, we missed something.
And to a wonderful Polish renovated cemetery at Lancet. So I think of these things as sort of missing pieces of the narrative that the Posthumous Landscape tells us. So David's going to show us Lancet, Poland, and then move east into the Ukraine.
This is an extraordinary synagogue. It's located in a town called Lancet in Polish, I think, and Lancet in English. It's located about 100 kilometers east of Krakow. The town has a population of 18,000 people today, and its main attraction is a 17th century castle that draws many tourists to the town. But for Jewish visitors, the major attraction is this synagogue, which was built in 1761. And one of the important things to say about this synagogue was it only exists because of Polish benefactors. The original construction of the synagogue was financed in 1761 by the Polish owner of the town. Don't forget, in the 18th century, Polish noblemen would own towns. And the nobleman of this town was named Stanislaw Lubomirski, and he paid for the construction of the synagogue. In 1939, when the Germans invaded Poland, they wanted to burn down the synagogue, and they attempted, but there was an owner of the Lancet Castle that I referred to earlier. His name was Alfred Potocki, and he intervened to save the building, but he couldn't save the interior. and the structure was used during the war to store grain. After the war, no Jews remained in Langcut, but there was a doctor there, and in 1956, when the town council proposed to tear down the building, because there were no Jews there and they didn't need the grain storage anymore, the doctor, whose name was Vladislav Belitsky, who had lost many Jewish friends during the war, came to the council and said, "We should save this building, and I'm going to raise funds privately to restore the synagogue." Well, he started in 56, and the synagogue was not restored until 1990, but it finally was restored, and it's beautiful. Like other synagogues in Poland, this is an example of what we call a nine-field design. The synagogue has 4 central pillars, and the ceiling is divided into 9 sections, each of them part of a vaulted ceiling, and the 4 pillars support the ceiling. And there are many synagogues of that period in Poland that look like this, that are architecturally similar. Also, between the 4 pillars is the bima for the synagogue, the reading platform for the prayers, and the bima faces the Aron Kodesh. This is not a synagogue that's functioning, there's no Torah, but you can see the 10 Commandments on the wall. The walls of the synagogue are painted with arcades containing the texts of Hebrew prayers. The spaces around the windows are decorated with stucco representations of animals from the Bible. And the back wall has painted symbols from the zodiac, which is a very common form of decor of 18th and 19th century synagogues. The Bag Street Synagogue in Montreal also has zodiac paintings around the wooden fence of the women's balcony. So it was very common decoration. And altogether, it's really the most spectacular restoration of a synagogue in all of Poland. Another interesting thing about the Langcut synagogue is that the caretaker, like in many small towns in Poland, the caretakers of the synagogues and cemeteries are not Jewish. There are all sorts of different people who have an interest or have developed an interest in Jewish heritage of Poland. So the caretaker at this synagogue, we met him, he was in his 40s, and he told us about the whole history of the synagogue. He showed us an exhibition of artifacts that he had uncovered in a geniza in the synagogue. A geniza is a ritual burial room for burying liturgical texts that are no longer useful or because they're damaged. And he also told us that he had learned Hebrew in order to interpret the prayers on the walls for Polish visitors to the synagogue. And he also said, a little shyly, he said he thinks he may have some Jewish ancestors in his family. Anyway, he was a wonderful and delightful person, and it was a pleasure to meet him. And someone just emailed me recently, a person who's half Jewish, half Polish, that they were just in Langcut in the past year, and this gentleman is still there guiding people when they come to the synagogue. As many of you know, and I want to start talking a bit about Ukraine, that Western Ukraine prior to World War II was actually part of Poland. So all the cities you see around Lviv and south of Lviv and just north of Lviv were part of the Second Polish Republic between the 2 world wars. Chernivtsi in the southern part of Western Ukraine was part of Romania, and some of the cities further to the east were part of Russia before the Second World War. All this territory became part of Ukraine after World War II, and remained part of Ukraine even after the demise of the Soviet Union and even after Ukraine became independent in 1991. The largest city in Western Ukraine is Lviv, or Lvov when it was part of Poland. It had about 110,000 Jews before the war, but today there are fewer than 2,000 Jews who live there, many of them poor and elderly. And there are still tensions in the community because of historic tensions between Jews and Ukrainians during the Second World War. For instance, during the Second World War, there was a historic Jewish cemetery in Lviv, dating back to the 14th century, on the grounds behind a building that was a Jewish maternity hospital. And during the war, the Nazis ordered this very old Jewish cemetery to be completely destroyed. All the stones were looted from the cemetery and used either for paving roads or for building material in the rest of the city. But a few small remnants of the cemetery were returned to the ground behind the maternity hospital, and you can still see some fragments of stones in the grassy area behind the former maternity hospital. In 1947, under the municipal government in the communist regime, all the land of the former cemetery was seized to make a large outdoor market in Lviv. And that market exists till today. And some members of the Jewish community who still live in Lviv have been fighting for decades to try and reclaim the market land on behalf of the community. The person leading that fight in Lviv is an Orthodox Jew named Melech Sheikhet. He's officially an official of the Council of Former, he's part of a council of former residents of the Soviet Union. But he's sort of a radical Jewish activist, a bit like a Ukrainian Jewish Ralph Nader. He has a group of young people working for him, all in their 30s, a lawyer, an archaeologist, a land title researcher, a couple of other researchers, and they all work with him on court cases to try to reclaim Jewish land and heritage sites throughout Ukraine. He's told us that he succeeded for one day to close down the public market that was built over the Jewish cemetery for a prayer service for one day, but he has never been able to succeed to reclaim the land out of the market, but he keeps trying even after 30 and 40 years. The only functioning synagogue in Lviv today is this 3-story building about 2 kilometers from the center that was built in 1924. It was called the Tzori Gilad Synagogue. Tzori Gilad are the Hebrew words for Balm of Gilead, B-A-L-M. And the building, built in 1924, was used by the Nazis as a stable and by the communists as a warehouse until it was returned to the Jewish community in 1989. The building was refurbished and restored and reopened in 2007. And the leader of the congregation now is a rabbi from Brooklyn, who's very active as the chief rabbi of Lviv and also of Western Ukraine. And I learned online recently that he's been very active in helping refugees during the war who've come from Eastern Ukraine, and he spends a lot of time helping them. There was one other synagogue that survived the war in Lviv. It was on 3 Vohilna Street, and it was built in 1842 by a Jewish merchant named Jacob Glanzer, so it's known as the Glanzer Synagogue. During the German occupation, the synagogue was used as a warehouse, but immediately after the war, this synagogue was returned to the Jewish community and was allowed to function for 14 years under the leadership of a Hasidic rabbi. But in 1962, the rabbi died, and the communist government decided to close this synagogue, and they stripped the interior of all valuables, including a large number of Torah scrolls. In 1991, the synagogue was finally returned to the Jewish community, but there was a lot of damage. You can see there was water damage to the ceiling and water damage in the sanctuary. Finally, in 2020, some work was done to refurbish the synagogue. I'd like to talk about one more synagogue that I photographed because there's an interesting story about it. And that's a synagogue in Chernivtsi, which is, of course, a West Ukrainian city close to the Romanian border. Before the war, 40% of the residents of Chernivtsi were Jewish. 40%, about 50,000 people. And during the war, under the Romanian dictatorship, the mayor of Chernivtsi saved 20,000 Jews. Because he said to the Romanian dictatorship, if you deport all the Jews, my city simply can't function. And he saved 20,000 people. The city today only has 2 functioning synagogues. One of them is called the Beit Beit Tfilah Binyamin. It was built in 1923, and this synagogue functioned from 1923 to the present day without interruption, even during the war, probably because of the protection of the mayor of the city. The rabbi from 1992 was a man named Noah Kaufmansky. He had started his life as an engineer under the Soviets, but he had a grandfather who was a rabbi in Chernivtsi. So he went to Israel to study, and he came back in 1992, and he became the rabbi of this synagogue. But much to his surprise, most of the people who came to see him for advice and for spiritual guidance were Christians, not Jews. So every day we were told, except maybe Shabbos, maybe even on Shabbos, Christians would line up to see Rabbi Kaufmansky to get his advice on various personal affairs. When we were photographing the synagogue, we had an interpreter, and we heard a woman who went up to talk to the rabbi, and she complained to the rabbi that she had a neighbor who was encroaching on her garden, and she wanted the rabbi to place a curse on him. The rabbi said, "We don't do curses, but we will pray for you and for the peaceful resolution of this conflict." In an interview later, the rabbi said that Christians in Ukraine feel that rabbis and Jews have a direct line to God, or a close relationship to God, and therefore their prayers would be heard and the intercessions would be granted. Now in 2011, another rabbi came to Chernivtsi, who was a Lubavitcher rabbi from the United States, and he took up a position in a newly refurbished small Orthodox synagogue. So there were now 2 synagogues. And the Lubavitcher rabbi was aghast, scandalized, when he found out that Kaufmansky was spending most of his time consoling Christians. But after 2 or 3 months, the Christians heard there was another rabbi in town, and they started going to him for advice. So after 2 or 3 months, he also was spending a lot of his days giving advice to Christians in the town. Anyway, it's a very interesting story. We just have a few more minutes. I should say something about the cover of the book.
Sure, but Kaufmansky, obviously he's a lucky Jew. Don't miss him. So when we started, you had the cover of the book, and now David has a story, of course, to tell you of its choice for its use, the image, and then the narrative associated with the character at the center of that photograph.
Yeah, just a little bit. I picked the name The Posthumous Landscape. It's a phrase from a poem by a famous Polish poet named Jerzy Fitzowski. Jerzy Fitzowski was a veteran of the Polish resistance during the war. He was the well-known biographer of the Jewish Polish writer Bruno Schulz, and in 1979 he wrote a beautiful book of poems called A Reading of Ashes. And one of the poems was called Posthumous Landscape, and that's why I chose that title for this book. Now the person on the cover of the book is from Khotin, which is a small town just northeast of Chernivtsi in western Ukraine. And the town of Khotin has 11,000 people today. It was part of Romania before the war, and now is part of western Ukraine. And before the war, there were 6,000 Jews in the town, and of course, almost all of them were killed. The synagogue that exists in Khotin today was built before the war, but was completely refurbished afterwards, and it's in very bad condition today. The man in the photo, his name is Yuri Davidovich, and he is one of 15 Jews who returned to Khotin after the war, having taken sanctuary in the Soviet Union during the war. His own family was deported by the Soviets before the German invasion to Kazakhstan because his father worked for a medical unit in the Soviet army. So his life was saved because his father had some relationship to the Soviet troops. For some reason, 15 Jews came back to this town in western Ukraine. I was in no other small town that had any Jewish population. And these people stayed for 6 decades. And the truth be told, when we visited them in 2016, it was a community living in poverty. Davidovich told us that 4 Jews attended services on Shabbos, but that they all prayed in Russian because none of them knew Hebrew. The town also contains a historic Jewish cemetery with many beautiful stones, and Davidovich and a caretaker are in charge and they take care of the cemetery. There was a lot of poverty in the town. When we approached the shul, for instance, there was a woman drunken lying on the sidewalk just near the shul. In our conversation, we asked Davidovich, is there a tension between Khotyn's few Jews and the rest of the people in town? And he said very pointedly, we have nothing and they have nothing. What is there to fight about? At the time we saw Davidovich, I don't know if he's alive anymore, he was living on a pension of $60 Canadian a month, and I think supplemented by possibly a donation from Jewish welfare agencies.
Anything concluding, or?
Yeah, if we have, do we have a minute? I think one of the things that, throughout Eastern Europe, there are many, many Jewish historical artifacts in hundreds of towns and places. Many isolated synagogues, beautifully carved tombstones, and they're all disappearing. Over time, I always say in 10 or 20 years, all that will be left of many of these places are the photographs. Every time I give this talk, I like to say that the amount of Jewish material culture in Eastern Europe is vast, that the tasks of cataloging, restoring, and preserving artifacts are limitless, and that the resources to do so are wholly inadequate. But I think something else has changed in the past 10 years since I was last in Eastern Europe. And those changes have been driven home and partly referred to earlier in the evening by the war in Ukraine and also to an extent by the war in Israel and Gaza. And that is, we are now in a world that is becoming more and more a post-Holocaust world. It's a world in which the memory of the Holocaust is fading and in which survivors are dying, and a world that is now more dangerous for Jews and also more dangerous for many other people. Even 10 years ago, I think it would have been very hard to imagine the degree to which authoritarianism and anti-Semitism would be resurgent today all over the world, including North America, and the degree to which many Jewish communities feel themselves to be in peril. But there's a bit of a lesson to be learned from all these cemeteries and synagogues and Jewish historical sites in Europe. Because wherever there is preservation or restoration of a Jewish historical site, it does not happen through the efforts of the Jewish community by itself. When a synagogue or a cemetery is restored, it takes the coordinated efforts and goodwill of many parties, many levels of government, local cities, local provinces, local governments, the European Union, including prominently among the European Union nations, Germany, many Jewish heritage foundations, and other foundations, such as the World Monuments Fund, just to name a few of the players, including Jews and many non-Jews working collaboratively. And when I look at the photographs in my book, I'm reminded most of all the people who were killed in these hundreds of locations throughout Eastern Europe, because their neighbors were indifferent or suddenly turned against them, and the Jews in these places had no allies to protect them. The Holocaust, as many of you know, was a local phenomenon. It was a phenomenon that could not have occurred without the collaboration of local authorities and ordinary people who decided that the time had arrived when they could kill Jews, but also other undesirable people with impunity. The lesson of the past, I believe, is that we need to work hard to defend our communities, but we cannot do it ourselves or only for ourselves. We need allies. We need to keep building bridges to build safe and tolerant societies, and not only for the benefit of our own communities. Thank you.
So Kat has a microphone, and we have time for some questions for David. So she'll bring it if you raise your hand. Over on my far right. Wait a second.
Hi, my name is Monica Edelman. My husband's from Bialystok, and we were there in August 2024. And there is a big organization of Jews from around Boston area, and it's called the Bialystoker Restoration. Yes, I know, it's your cousin. And it's actually Mr. and Mrs. Brownstein, it's her cousin, Deegan, Amy Deegan, and a group of young Jews who had family in that region, and they've done an amazing job of restoring, and actually the Polish government gave them a lot of money, including donations from other people. And we visited another small town near Bialystok called Dąbrowa. And there was a small cemetery, well, not that small, a Jewish cemetery, and it was a school teacher with high school students who were upkeeping it and who were cleaning it and, you know, restoring it, trying to, so there is hope. I come from Bucharest, and actually the cemetery there is in terrible disrepair, and there's no money, I think. So, but it was really something to be able to see this group of people plus other places in Poland. The local people, yes, the local people, young local people.
Not Jewish at all.
No, and they, I mean, I have a little video of them, you know, picking up the stones and cleaning them, and that's all. Well, yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation and the visit to Jewish communities and buildings and material culture in Poland and Ukraine. What happened to the Torah scrolls at the third Lubov synagogue, the one that got gutted and then was returned to the Jewish communities, that there were Torah scrolls that were tossed?
It was very interesting. They had gathered Torah scrolls from all the synagogues in Lviv and stored them in that synagogue. And when the communist government of the city took all the Torah scrolls away, they put them in the Museum of Ethnography in Lviv. So there are 100 Torah scrolls in the Museum of Ethnography in Lviv, and the person I showed before, Melech Sheikhet, has been trying to get some of the Torah scrolls released for Jewish events and for Jewish events in Western Ukraine. But there were 100 Torah scrolls taken.
Okay, and I just wanted to finish the question. Thank you for the answer to the first part of the question. The second is, were there other archives, and it's very interesting to discover what happened to these Torah scrolls, and they actually weren't destroyed, that they got saved somehow. And were there other archives, and like the Sidurim and the prayer books and the Talmud and if they have the Mishnah, do they have the Mishnah? Did you look, were there books and libraries and Batei Midrash still connected to the shuls? And what were the contents of these, Batei Midrash, if they still exist?
I have no idea, I'm sorry. I don't know more.
I'm wondering if you have any other stories about the people you met or encountered, maybe from the,
We're running out of time, but we were in a town called Tomaszów Mazowiecki, and that's a town with a cemetery with a wall around it. And we arrived at the town in the rain, and we had a guide with us at the time, so it was prearranged. And the people, everywhere you go to a Polish Jewish cemetery, you have to find the person who has the key. So you can go to the smallest town, and you can go to a playground, and you'll meet a woman in the playground, and you'll say, in our broken Polish, we're looking for the Jewish cemetery. And the person will take out a cell phone and call the person who has the key. They'll know who the person is. And 10 minutes later, that person will show up. So it's amazing. Anyway, in this town, Tomashav Mazowiecki, it was a couple who were hired by the city of Lodz, because the town is not that far from Lodz, and they had the key. So I was in the cemetery photographing, and my wife and our guide were talking to the people, and they told them that every year on All Saints' Day, which is a Polish Christian holiday, when Poles go to repair the grounds and pay respects at the graveyard, at the gravestones of their ancestors, every year on that day, this couple, who were not Jewish, would organize people from this town to come into the Jewish cemetery every year and clean it up and pay their respects. So that was a very interesting story.
So David, thank you for these magnificent pictures and your stories. I can hear my parents' voices discussing each of the towns you mentioned and wondering if they had relatives there or cousins or what have. Were any of those righteous people that you found, the caretaker or the mayor, were they honored in Israel?
I have no idea, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I just don't know.
Thank you. I think we'll end with Ray's question because I'm going to call you back up in a second. But thank you so much, Norman, and thank you so much, David. Anyone who's interested in learning more, copies of the remarkable book are available for sale just to my left over here. And now I would like to call up Rachel Groper, our co-president here at the museum, for a concluding remark.
So I wrote 12 pages, but I'm only going to read one paragraph. I have to confess that I've been part of commemoration of Kristallnacht my whole life, and it's never a cheerful one. Although if you're doing the math, not quite as old as the actual commemoration of when it happened. As we conclude this evening of remembrance, we do so with reflection and gratitude. Gratitude for you to be here, an underlying of the fact that commemoration is not a passive activity, and we need you to remember and to support our memory work. Tonight we have honored the memory of Kristallnacht and those whose lives were shattered by hatred. We have also affirmed our shared responsibility to remember, not only as witnesses to history, but as guardians of its lessons. Though the survivors and witnesses of that night grow fewer, I'm very conscious of being an endangered species. As we grow fewer with each passing year, our legacies endure in our work, in our community, in our museums. It is through remembrance and education that we ensure that their voices continue to guide us. Though the survivors and witnesses of that night grow small, as I mentioned, we are looking forward to something very positive, and that's the opening of our new museum in 2027. I am determined to be there. We renew our promise and commit to carry this mission forward, to keep memory alive, to inspire understanding, and to stand firmly against hatred in all its forms, especially in what we see around us lately. We reaffirm tonight our commitment to humanity, to justice, and to one another. Thank you for joining us, for being here on such a bad weather night. And to our partners at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, a special appreciation for helping to ensure that remembrance remains at the heart of who we are and what we do. Thank you. Have a good evening.